Angus, it's brilliant to see you. Thank you so much for coming. Been a while since I've seen you in person. I don't know when the last time I did see you in person was, but it was probably about 5 or 6 years ago, I think.
Yeah, I would say something like that. Yeah, I can't remember either. It's a bit of a whirlwind, really.
Yeah. And in that time, it seems like you've been very busy. You're a Whisky Sponge. You're a Whisky Fun contributor, writer, taster, and now you're an independent bottler. So you've got a lot going on in your life. But before we get into talking about what you've been up to in your sort of career in whiskey and things like that, what's in your glass tonight, sir?
So first of all, I'm just being very on brand. I'm having a dram of our Equinox and Solstice bottling from last summer, because we do them seasonally, so 4 bottlings a year. And this one was, the name on the label is Candle Kitty, and it's a unnamed Highland single malt, 10 years old. I mean, it's very obviously Clynelish, but it's really, I was very happy with it. It was 3 first fill barrels of 2010 vintage, and just got loads of distillery character. Really worked at the bottling strength, 48.5. Just, if you like that big, waxy, sort of super fresh, slightly floral, but also slightly citrusy. It's just got that lovely coastal Highland character.
I've yet to try. I mean, I've tried quite a lot. You will have tried a lot more than I have, but Clynelish, I'm not sure it makes bad whiskey. You know, it's always of a decent standard pretty consistently.
Some of the other work I do is I'm on the panel for the Scotch Malt Whisky Society, so I get to try a lot of cask samples that way. And some of the really interesting stuff that's been coming through in the last couple of years is batches. They've got big batches of casks from Clynelish from 2012, 2011, 2013. And it's very interesting watching the distillery character like vary a little bit from batch to batch, but the quality is still high. You know, they make great distillate there for sure.
Nice. Well, I think we'll just get tucked straight into the kind of main part of the interview, mate. And we were just chatting before we kind of started recording, and I'm trying to remember the first time I kind of saw your name, and the first time I became aware of you was when I was at Edrington, because I was working at Highland Park and Macallan at that time. So, and I thought it was maybe around 2011, 2010, something like that, but you've told me it's 2013. What were you up to back then when you started the Whisky Sponge? Were you already working in whiskey at that point?
So that was when I was traveling in 2011, and when I came back, that was kind of like the kickoff point for what we might call my career, for want of a better term. I'd started working in auctions. I worked for an auction company in Glasgow called Mulberry Bank Auctions, and then I was a director for a few years at Whisky Online Auctions, which are based down in Blackpool. So that was like, before that, I'd done a number of things. Like, I'd been a tour guide at Ardbeg Visitor Centre, and I'd worked in a whiskey bar in London. I'd worked for a winemaker in Alsace, and classic Scottish whiskey person stuff, like working in odd bins, working in Glasgow wine merchants, things like that. And so I had this background, and I had quite a bit of experience with old bottles. So I just sort of slotted into this auction world when I came back from traveling. I wasn't sure what I was going to do. I had no plans. And then while I was doing that, I was also writing some blog entries for Whisky Online, their website. And out of that, I just started thinking more about writing, and I was thinking, well, no one's taking the piss out of all these really silly things that happen in whiskey frequently. And so I thought, well, I'll just try my hand at that for a while. So there's a bit of an experiment really in the beginning, and it just kind of evolved. Everything I've done just seems to have started as, well, let's just try this and see what happens, and it just evolves from there. And it's the same thing with bottling. I never expected to do it, and yet here I am.
Yeah, the sponge is funny, right? Because I think what it does is it definitely draws out. And I'll be interested to know just like what parts of this are true or just in my head. But there's loads of good things that have happened in whiskey, and you do sort of poke a funny, and in a nice way, in a positive way, a nice spin on that through the sponge. There's the bad stuff, the stuff that's just crap that we know. Sometimes the big guys, and sometimes the stuff that happens in the industry is not always for the betterment of the category. The real stuff, the ugly stuff, and the infuriating, frustrating stuff that seems to happen within whiskey. And there's a combination of all those things in the sponge that pop up from time to time.
Yeah, I think in the early days, the sponge was probably a bit crueler and a bit more scathing than it is now. I mean, I don't have time to do it as much as I did, which I'm a bit sad about. I would like to be able to publish more, but I tend not to write anything unless I'm pretty kind of geared up to do it and I'm confident that I've got the energy and the, a clear idea of what I'm going to do, that it's going to be a good quality bit of writing at the end of it. I don't just want to keep hammering away, putting out half-assed sort of mediocre stuff. So I'm a bit, I will only write something unless I feel motivated to do it. But in the early days when I had a bit more time and I was really sort of going at it quite hard, it was probably quite a bit of anger behind it, and like, this is, there's so much bullshit going on. This stuff is ridiculous. It needs calling out, whatever.
Yeah.
I think it's probably evolved more towards just being very silly and surreal, and I don't like just angry writing for the sake of it. If you're gonna criticize, have something meaningful and truthful to say, I think. But the surreal and silly and sort of flights of fancy and almost like quasi metaphysical science fiction themes and stuff, that's kind of more my speed these days, just because I'm quite philosophical myself about whiskey and about life, and I think whiskey is taken far too seriously a lot of the time. So that's kind of my antidote to it, is let's just talk nonsense and invest it all with a bit more fun and just relax and remember that life's arduous and crazy enough as it is, without taking something like whiskey too seriously as well.
Yeah, I picked up on that. I read the passage that you put together following the passing of your dad, which was maybe 2 or 3 entries ago, I think it was. Yeah. And you do actually mention that. You say if the Whisky Sponge has a philosophy, it's not to take life or whiskey too seriously, and that's the other side of it as well, is that despite the silly craziness and the angriness and stuff that's happened throughout the Sponge, but every now and then there's a real honest account in there too. So I think when I look back at the Whisky Sponge and my interactions with it, I've always found it a bit more of a roller coaster of emotions, and I think that's the
yeah,
key.
Absolutely. I mean, I think at the end of the day, the Sponge is just it's just a reflection of me and some of the things I think, and obviously my opinions about whiskey and my experiences with it. And the act of writing itself is really probably more of a passion or something that's quite precious to me than whiskey. So I take it quite seriously, and that's why I don't, as I said, I don't write that much these days, I suppose, because I don't want to do it unless I think I'm going to do a good job, and unless I think I've got something that is actually useful to say, that I think is truthful, or just at least being true to what I think, and that I can stand behind it and argue my case for it. And I just think sometimes the internet is just, it's like the Mr. Creosote in Monty Python, but just with opinion, just one wafer thin opinion, and the whole thing's going to blow. And I think
you must have got a few interesting emails after some of the posts over the years.
Oh yeah, I'm sure. Yeah. I've had people sort of corner me saying, "Why do you write that? That was cruel." First of all, I've had people sort of introduce and say, "Oh, I love that thing in the Sponge," and then after a few drinks, they're like, "Why did you write that? That was unnecessary." And then I've had a couple of legal letters over the years. I've had, but by and large, most of the feedback I've had has been positive. You can't put yourself out there in this day and age without garnering some criticism, and I'm sure that there's plenty things in there now, if I were to wade back through a lot of the old posts, that I would disagree with or do differently. I'm very, very suspicious of anyone whose opinions don't change and evolve as they grow themselves.
Yeah, the thing is in whiskey, and I've found this, especially being on like the brand owner side, my whole career pretty much, is that you don't get strong opinions very often, and there's a lot of kind of holding back, of opinions from the industry, and you don't really see people kind of going poking fun at things and really sort of giving their honest opinion. And I think that was what was really refreshing about what you did with the Sponge, was as an independent, you can have an open opinion, you can have a bit of fun, no one needs to take it too seriously, and you were able to voice that. And I think there'd be a lot of people out there who would like to be more opinionated, but perhaps in their careers it's a tough one, if they're working for.
Whiskey's a corporate world. It's a very conservative. This is the thing. I love whiskey, but I'm not so much a fan of the whiskey industry. I mean, it's a quite conservative, frequently lacking in imagination world, often quite corporate, often very rules based, rules bound. And, you know, I think the product and sometimes the people suffer because of that. But I do also think on the flip side, a lot of that's changing quite fast. Like I couldn't have had the career I've had if I started 10 years previously.
No.
You know, I've just kind of invented, people say, oh, what's your job? And I don't know. I'm just a generic whiskey person who's kind of cobbled together a career for themselves. And I don't think I could have done it earlier. And this is why I say, you know, I don't know where I'm going to be 10 years from now, what I'm going to be doing. I'm just making it up as I go along almost.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
But you know, the whiskey as a culture and as a product and a world is big enough now to support more independent people that can have, you know, their own opinions, their own voice. It's very difficult because I think the architecture of things like drinks writing is not well paid. There's lots of advertising involved. There's lots of leaning on industry associations and industry support, and therefore there's a kind of an expected quid pro quo in these things. So like I don't really do paid whiskey writes anymore because it's not an interesting thing to do. You can't write, you know, for a whiskey magazine, in my view, the way that I can write myself for the Sponge. So I just keep it as a hobby, or, you know, or in Whiskey Fun or something like that.
Yeah, so let's talk about Whiskey Fun, because Whiskey Fun's a great resource actually. That I was doing some work quite recently for Little Mill actually, and I've tried a few over the years. I haven't tried them all, and as a data source to go back and look at tasting notes to get an opinion, which is really important, I think, especially if you get a sense of what people like. You know, when you write there's types of whiskies that you often pick out, and elegant whiskies that like Clynelish, they've got that lovely texture, waxiness,
Yeah,
you know,
absolutely.
not battered with sherry casks. You know, that style of whiskey seems to be the style that you like, and I've picked up on that a little bit. And I thought, I wonder what he's written about Little Miller. I wonder what Serge has written about, and I've got a feel, I think, for what Serge likes. It's brilliant. It's a great source of information for people, and it's a massive database now. I mean, it must be the single biggest database of whiskey tastings, right?
I don't know about that. I would say. I mean, it's the single biggest source, I think, of one person's opinions. I think what the great strength with Serge is that he's got clearly defined tastes and opinions about whiskey, and he always telegraphs that. You know, he always says up front, these are my preferences as a taster and as a whiskey lover and as a drammer. And so, you know, when you read his notes and when you take the note with the score together, I think that's what makes it quite a powerful tool, because people can judge or calibrate to that based on their own preferences, and they can judge that against Serge's, and he's quite consistent from note to note. I think there's probably a few like old incredible bottlings from, you know, back in the very early days of Whiskey Fun, 2002, 2004, where, you know, if he were to try them now, they'd probably be a few points higher. But back then he started comfortably in what we always call the age of innocence, and these whiskies were just abundant. They were just 60s malts, old glories sloshing about the shelves, or, you know, 80 pound a bottle, springback local barley. Oh, go on then. You know, so it was a different world.
Even your 12-year-olds and 18-year-olds, and I remember looking back at just some of the sort of vattings and stuff, and overaging back then was, I mean, more old whiskey than the way, you know, than there was the age it was meant to be, you know.
Like the Springbank 12s that were brought down to strength with old underproof casks and things like that, you know, incredible bottlings.
It's mad, isn't it?
You can't imagine happening now without a lot more fanfare and a much higher price tag. But I think that's one of the things that's been the strength. It is a great database, and also because it's still I mean, people. The problem is now that whiskey's so expensive, so scores become politicized and they garner a lot of attention because there's this big perception that's, you know, these scores are so powerful and they shift units and everyone's hanging on a knife edge waiting for the score to land, and that's going to dictate the success of their bottling. And, you know, commercial well-being of companies and employees are bound up in this. I don't believe that is really the case in the way that some people say it is. Serge's scores absolutely have power, But you know, I think that what we've forgotten is that this is still a hobby for him, and always has been, and it still is. And I think, and he said several times to me, if he really got fed up of it, and he's come close a couple of times,
Yeah.
I'm just going to stop. I'm just going to pull the plug and away with it. It's not a catalogued it's not a properly SEO'd catalogued site. It's still running on like direct fired horse-drawn internet and web architecture, like web 0.1 that he's on or something like that. It's really old school, and it would be an enormous job to drag Whisky Fun kicking and screaming into like today's modern,
drop it onto a WordPress modern sort of version of itself. And
I think that's the charm. It's a vintage website. It remains, you know, quite authentic. It's got a very clear voice from Serge. I'm always quite reticent to sort of, you know, to say that I'm a big part of it, because I've only been doing it for a few years. I post, you know, on Saturday once a week at most, and I consider myself very lucky and honored to be on it. And I think I'm on it because Serge and I, you know, we're good pals. We get on well, and I think we just share the same tastes in whiskey and a lot of similar ideas and philosophies behind it. And I think he, you know, he's recognized that in me, and you know, I think I'm just quite lucky that he's allowed me onto his stomping ground, really. So
I mean, the thing that strikes me, and I know you're busy, and I know he's busy because he's got a real job as well. And you guys do this off your own back, and you must be tasting, well, like you say, you do it on a Saturday, you publish it on a Saturday, but there's a lot of writing involved. They're not 3 or 4 word tasting notes. You guys really do put a lot of effort into what you write, which is not easy because you're not always in the right mind space for that. And then the other thing is just the whiskies themselves. There's a whole logistical thing, getting samples and getting bottlings and things like that. How do you guys kind of navigate all of that? That must be quite time consuming still. It's not a 5-minute job, is it?
It's not. The getting samples now is not such a big deal because so many people love Whisky Fun that Serge gets sent, you know, oceans of samples, and I also get sent quite a few as well. And so I've always got enough. And I also, for my own part, open quite a lot of bottles still, and I've got quite a lot of, you know, interesting old and rare things. And also in the community of whiskey lovers around the world, you know, there's lots of friends out there that when they open old bottles, they'll send Serge or I, or both of us sometimes, samples of the, you know, just 2cl samples, tasters, because they love to see these things on Whisky Fun. They love people love to feed the beast. They want to see Whisky Fun keep growing, and they're really interested to see published, you know, opinions and notes from Serge about these bottles that they've opened themselves. And that's a great community aspect to it. So the samples thing has not really been an issue, although I will say the last couple of years during COVID, when there's no festivals on, so Serge, you know, puts quite a lot of work in, more than I do, in that he'll go around festivals very deliberately looking for whiskies that he thinks will be interesting, and looking for new bottlings that he thinks are interesting, new distilleries he's not tried. And he buys a lot of samples for Whisky Fun as well. So I know he buys you know, samples from like Master of Malt or Whiskey Exchange if there's ones that he wants to have on the site. So it's a big mix. It's lots of people sending samples. Also quite interesting, a lot of sort of more distillery official companies choosing not to send samples because they just think they're going to get a bad review. So
really, that's interesting.
So that's a phenomenon as well. But COVID made it difficult, and Brexit has made it difficult because a lot of companies struggle to send samples into Europe now without them, you know, attracting, you know, duty charges and things. That's been a nightmare for Serge, particularly the number of parcels arrive and it's another 60 euros, 90 euros to pay for a duty, and you know, it's not really a sustainable way to do things. So there's been a bit of a difficulty in that side, but overall getting samples not difficult. Time consuming thing is writing the notes, in my experience.
And I guess that's one of those, right? It's, you've committed to it, you're going to keep rolling with it and keep contributing, and like you say, keep the beast rolling, because it is brilliant. I mean, I like I say, I check it regularly. I think most people do, and it's great to see it. It's now on Instagram as well. People can sort of follow what you guys have been tasting, and it's it's easy to follow.
For me, it's also a hobby. I mean, people forget, and you know, it's difficult because obviously I'm professional as well, and I know that being a contributor to Whisky Fun has meaning to me in that sense. So there's a bit of a have your cake and eat it aspect to what I do, but you know, but at the end of the day, it is a hobby and it is fun, and it's not something I want to earn out of. It's not something I particularly want to expand, but I don't want to stop either. Even if I just end up getting to the point where I do, you know, 2 or 3 notes a week, or post a couple of times a month or something. I love being part of it, and I enjoy the fun that we have doing it. And that is really, I mean, people forget the title of the website is almost a philosophy in itself. It's whiskey fun, have fun with whiskey. It's so much synergy between that and what I do. You know, I talked about with what I do on the sponge and what I do with the bottlings now. Like it's really just about trying to have fun. And so I take that aspect of it pretty seriously, and I'm keen to, the moment it stops being fun or becomes too difficult, I probably would just stop and step back from it. But at the moment, I don't think that's, you know, there's any reason to do that, or it's on the cards. So I'm going to happily keep chipping away at it, even if I just end up doing, you know, 2 or 3 random old bottlings every couple of weeks or something. You know?
Yeah, you can always turn it down, right? Because it doesn't always have to be 6 Isleys or 6, you know, distillery versions or whatever. And you mentioned the indie bottlings then. So, I mean, what I've noticed within your bottlings, great labels, limited releases, high quality, stuff I look at and think, I really need to try that. I definitely need to try that one. That can get expensive quite quickly. But that's credit to you for pulling all that together. How did that start? That's something you've been doing for a couple of years.
Yeah, so that's about two years now. And that really started again almost by incident. So my business partner, Ian, he had done some bottling under a series called Copper Monument, and he'd had mixed success with this, you know, some success, some not. And, you know, he'd learned a bit doing it. And he approached me and said, are you interested to collaborate? You know, we've done this Copper Monument thing, but I think we would like to try a different approach. I don't know what that would be. Do you have any ideas? Would you like to collaborate? And it just so happened I'd been thinking it would be nice to do a bottling for Sponge, or just, yeah, and I didn't know what that would be. I just assumed maybe I'll just somehow buy a cask of whiskey and do it with a Sponge themed label just for fun or something. It was just a sort of random idea in the back of my head that is probably nothing would have ever happened if Ian hadn't reached out. So that's really how it started. He said, "Oh, got any ideas?" And I said, "Well, thinking about doing something with Sponge." And so he said, "Well, I've got these couple of casks," and they were really nice ones. There's a 1981 Glenmurray and a 1997 Hazelburn, and both really lovely quality. And I thought, well, this is great. Let's just do a couple of Whisky Sponge labels. And so we did, really rudimentary kind of. I look at those early bottlings, and you know, it's quite innocent what we were doing there.
Yeah, blame the brand team. That's
yeah, absolutely. There's so much to learn, and so I was so, you know, in the shallows in terms of experience in these things. It's been a very steep learning curve the last couple of years. But from there, again, it's just one of these things that just evolved. And for the third bottling, we thought, well, where else can we go? What else can we do for supplying interesting whiskies? So I had a conversation with Signatory, and I'm very lucky in that Andrew Symington is a big fan of the Sponge. So Andrew Symington, who owns Edredar Signatory, and he's a big fan of the Sponge, and he was happy to let us do bottling under third party. Let's select a cask and do a third party label. And again, that was another piece of the puzzle. And so we've just been quite, like, I'm very focused and determined on finding quality whiskey, whether that's young or old or expensive or affordable or whatever. It's the thing that primarily motivates me is, are we releasing something delicious and beautiful that I am happy to drink? I can't always afford everything we bottle, and that's always going to be the case in whiskey, I believe. But I stand behind the quality of the contents. And if you start with the contents, then the next stage is what's on the outside. What are you doing with this bottle? Because I'm very much against superfluous packaging in whiskey. I don't want boxes, don't want bags and tins.
Yeah.
I just want a bottle. And I think, right, what can we do with a bottle and a label? And that's where so much of my sort of motivation and challenge to myself has been, is what can we do that's a wee bit different? Or how can we have fun? How can we do something that might be, that just embraces the themes of the Sponge blog, but transplants them onto a bottle label? So some of it is satirical, most of it's very surreal and silly. Yeah. Some of it's very funny. Some of it's got a touch more sort of pathos or melancholy, like some of the writing on the blog has. Yeah. And that was really where it all just sprang from. And from there, it's just evolved. You know, it started out as we were just a wee partnership. Now we're a proper company. We've hired people. You know, we've just taken on Lassie, who's going to do marketing for us. She's doing a great job. So we're becoming a proper company.
Yeah.
And you know, it's been a very rapid journey, very quick. And so we've been playing catch up with ourselves a lot, and we've had to learn so much so fast. But we're very lucky. We have a really good team. We have good people behind it with amazing business experience. And I'm frequently humbled by all the things I like. You know, I've sat in Teams meetings looking at spreadsheets, sort of inwardly dying on a precipice, thinking,
what is this?
How the hell am I going to get my head around unit economics? What the fuck?
Yeah.
Because we go that, you know, we have that side of it, that, you know, the presentational aspect looks, you know, all about colorful labels and funny images and silly rear labels and stuff, and tasty whiskies. But independent bottling is not that simple. And there's a lot of like serious discussion and analyzing data and, you know, crunching numbers going on behind the scenes that supports that and helps make it successful.
Yeah, but you talk about that. You've written a piece on that, and it's brilliant. You know, it's a great insight into what life is like as an independent bottler. And I think some people may think, and I meet people all the time, I want to get a cask of whiskey, I want to bottle it, I'm going to sell it in my local shops and stuff. And that's fabulous. But, you know, there's quite a lot of other things that need to happen to get that bottle into that shop that you're not quite understanding, you know.
In some ways, it's funny because in some ways, independent bottling is literally just sending emails until some bottles arrive somewhere.
Yeah.
But then on the flip side of that, there's, you know, sending emails is also navigating all these different, you know, amazing. It's blown my mind how easy it is to just find your time and your energy being consumed by this thing, which is like, why the fuck am I spending so long talking about this thing?
Yeah.
Why have I had 4 phone calls about foil today?
Yeah.
How does that happen?
Mad, isn't it?
Yeah, it just does. And it's so, yeah, I would caution anyone not to get into independent bottling, just so that there's less competition for the
less competition and more people buying your bottles. That's right.
Yeah. Although that's the thing, you know, that I wrote that thing the other day, and I keep thinking of things that I should have added to it. And one of the things that I should have added is that I actually think the current scene in Scotland is one of the most exciting times for independent bottling, because you've got a lot of people who are my contemporaries, you know, like the Thompson brothers. You've got Mark Watt, Ian Croucher, you know, you've got you know, great people at Adelphi, and you know, all these Gregor at Lady the Glen, and all these by and large younger folk or people that have had their own journey in whiskey and have decided to carve out their own path. And it's great, you know, a rising tide floats many ships, and there's room for all these people, and they're all really idiosyncratic, very strong, identifiable companies which reflect the people that are behind them, and in some cases just the, you know, the one or two people that run them. And I think that's great. That's great for whiskey, and we all put out widely different things.
Yeah.
That sort of stamp of personality is on the labels, on the liquid, and on the way they talk about themselves. And that's, I think, one of the things that makes me really excited and glad to be doing it, you know.
Yeah, the thing I'm most excited about, I'm involved in Fable as well. So, you know, that there's another sort of example of, I think, sort of smaller groups of people coming together and just trying to make something happen. You know, they've got an idea. Don't know, most of us just don't know how to make it happen, despite the fact that we've worked for the big companies and we've dealt with production and things like that. It's very different when you do it for yourself. But I think one of the things that kind of struck me, just as you were sort of rattling off those names, and it's the energy, it's the passion, and it's this kind of little bit of I guess it's everyone helping one another, but at the same time, it's this little element of competitiveness amongst the groups within that as well, which is a healthy thing.
Yeah, and you'll always have that in any business field like that, and any one which is such a social and cultural world as well. You know, it's our jobs, but it's also our lives and our hobbies. And there's not many industries where there's such a thin margin between those different aspects of life. There's so much crossover, and that's I do think, yeah, there's obviously healthy competition, but there's also a lot more truthful and authentic. This goes back to what we were saying earlier about, you couldn't have done this 10 years previously, perhaps, had the sort of job, for want of a better word, that I've tried to make for myself. I think that's happening with a lot of these folk. They're putting out fun, different, interesting whiskies, and they've got their own styles, and they're being true to themselves, and they're being true in how they talk about whiskey and how they talk about their products. And someone like Mark Watt is the sort of least inauthentic or varnished character in whiskey, and I think that's brilliant. Whiskey needs more people like that, I think.
Yeah, no, totally. And the thing is I was at a couple of whiskey shows over the last few months or so. What really struck me, and I stopped, to be fair, I had pretty much stopped going to them quite a long time ago, and I didn't go a lot when I was working on the sort of brand side anymore. And not because I didn't want to necessarily, just because I was busy with work. I've got kids, and I can't give every Saturday up to just go and taste whiskey with people. It's just, I couldn't do it anymore. And as I was kind of listening to people and watching people moving around, it really struck me how many non-geeks, like people who are quite new to whiskey, were willing and looking out for some of the independent bottling products, really coming over. I've never seen this before. I really, really want to try it. Cask strength, I haven't got a lot of experience, but I'm willing to taste it. And it was brilliant, because I've always felt that in 10 years ago, like you said, if you'd gone back 10 years, could you have done it now? Then maybe not. You can do it now. 10 years ago, I still feel independent bottlings was still very niche.
Yeah, I think so. But I think that consumers generally are smarter and more wise to bullshit and manufactured gibberish and stories. And I think people a bit more intuitively certainly in what they eat and drink. Younger generations now are far more interested in, all right, what am I consuming? Who's made it? Why have they made it? How have they made it? What's their values? What's their ethos? Why do they decide to do this? And I think people hone in on quality a bit more, and I think they respond well to products which also have a sense of fun and don't take themselves too seriously. So the more that those values disperse and kind of percolate throughout whiskey and independent bottling, I think it makes it a more welcoming environment and a less scary and intimidating product and culture for people to come into that are perhaps newish to it, or know they like whiskey but don't know a huge amount about it, like you say. And
I think it has. It's become less scary, and ultimately that's what I'm seeing. It's brilliant actually to go back to the festivals, or even just to stand in some of the shops and just kind of see what people do. And the creativity is the other thing that comes through in independent bottles that perhaps a big brand can't quite do anymore, because it's like moving a ship, isn't it? Sometimes getting some of their products out. They've got a brand that's established, and
I hear a lot about the sort of internal goings on of these bigger companies, and like one of my ambitions is I'd love to do a bigger product. I'd love to have the chart. My dream would be if someone from Edrington rang me up and said, "Come and do a series of Highland Park whiskies for us." Like, fucking yes, I would love to do something like that. But first of all, no one in my wildest dreams is ever going to call up me to come and do that. And secondly, it's probably a totally different thing to independent bottling. It's a law unto itself, and if I think the spreadsheets are bad in our company or confusing, then I think I'd probably be lost in a world of numbers that would from which I'd never recover if I tried to do it.
Stock models are an interesting thing. I remember once sitting in on the 30-year plan for Macallan, and what I realized was that nobody actually knows. It's great. That's what I took from that. It's a kind of finger in the air, and whoever says it most confidently is probably closest to being right. It's as simple as that.
30-year plans can probably change as well. I imagine.
Well, that's my point exactly. Yeah. Let's go in that direction. That'll be fine. No problem. Let's do it.
Yeah. No, I would like to do bigger, sort of larger scale products, because I think I like the challenge, and I like particularly the challenge of trying to create character and quality on that scale. It's very hard. I mean, this is the thing about independent bottling. It's why so many of them end up, the longer, more established ones have all got distilleries now, because independent bottling is not, it's not a monopoly, but a distillery is kind of like a mini monopoly. If you make a really good whiskey and you brand it successfully, no one can really take that away from you. You can sort of carve out a degree of market share that's yours, and there's dependability and a bit of security there. But it's very hard to get that with independent bottling. It's you're constantly, even if you've got a successful brand, like I think Whisky Sponge has a lot of goodwill as a brand. I think people like it, but at the end of the day, there's so much competition for people's spend, and it's still the distillery name more than anything else that motivates, alongside the price, that motivates whether someone decides to purchase or not. And that's something which you only have so much control over. So it's, that's where I think the challenge is, and will always be for independent bottling. It's why a lot of them have to.
No, it's brilliant. It's a great insight, actually, and just to where you're at and how things are going. So where can people buy the Sponge bottlings then? Where are they available?
You can go to our website, decadentdrinks.com, and just sign up for an account, and you can sign up to the mailing list that way. Being on the mailing list is the best way, because you'll find out first and foremost about new releases there. But you can also follow us on Instagram, Decadent Drinks, or at Decadent Drinks. And there's the Decadent Drinks Facebook page. Just search Facebook for Decadent Drinks.
Perfect.
And you can follow along there, and you should be able to get all the relevant info there. But definitely, I would say to people, if you're interested in what we're doing, go on our website, sign up to the mailing list.
Legend. Brilliant, mate. Thank you so much for joining us, man.
Thank you very much. We enjoyed it.